You never really think about how fragile your sense of safety is, until it's shattered. And for me, that happened during a shift that should have been just another quiet night. It all started like every other. I took my usual seat in the control room of the old building, the kind of place that was never meant to feel alive. It was just cold concrete, dimly lit hallways, and the soft hum of fluorescent lights that flickered from time to time. My job was simple: watch the security cameras, walk the floors a couple of times, and make sure nobody broke in. It was dead quiet. No one came here anymore, not after dark. I should have been used to the eerie stillness, but that night, something felt off. I chalked it up to exhaustion at first. My eyes had been glued to the monitors for hours, watching the same empty corridors loop in static. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking under me, and rubbed my face, trying to shake the fatigue. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement on one of the screens. At first, I thought it was just the camera glitching, maybe a shadow cast from the lights. But there it was, something in the north wing. It was barely visible, just a dark blur sliding across the edge of the frame. My stomach dropped. I leaned in closer, squinting at the grainy footage. The hallway was empty. I waited, my pulse quickening, but nothing else moved. The shadow had vanished. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. A trick of the light, maybe, or just me being paranoid. But deep down, I felt it. That creeping sense of unease crawling up my spine, the kind you get when you know you're not alone but can't prove it. I scanned the other monitors, checking every corner, every inch of those damn hallways, but everything was still. Too still. The hours dragged on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The air felt heavier, oppressive. My thoughts started spiraling. Maybe there was someone hiding in the building, some freak who had snuck in while I wasn't paying attention. Maybe I was just tired, losing my grip. I told myself to stop overthinking. It was just an empty building. But then, just as I was about to let out a breath of relief, I saw it again. The shadow. Only this time it wasn't on the edge of the frame. It was standing dead center in the hallway, still as a corpse. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark, human-shaped figure. But it wasn't right. It felt wrong. Unnatural. Like it didn't belong in this world. I stared at the screen, waiting for it to move, to do something, but it just stood there. And that's when the lights in the hallway started to flicker. One by one, they blinked out, plunging the corridor into complete darkness. My breath caught in my throat. I reached for the radio on my desk, but my hand was shaking so hard I could barely grab it. I called out, "Who's there?" But my voice sounded weak, almost scared. There was no answer, just silence. And then the static on the monitor deepened, the screen flickered, and the shadow was gone. I felt a chill creep through the room, colder than any draft could explain. That's when I knew something was inside the building, and it was coming closer. The minutes that followed felt eternal, stretching and bending in the stillness of that forsaken control room, as though time itself had become warped by the dread that gnawed at my sanity. The weight of the air had changed. It pressed upon my chest like a suffocating shroud, making every breath shallow, a rasp that echoed too loudly in the silence. I sat there, paralyzed, with my eyes fixed upon the now blank monitor, waiting, no, dreading, what might come next. It is strange how the mind, when left alone with its fears, becomes its own worst tormentor. Every fleeting shadow became a phantom. Every groan of the building, a whisper of something sinister lurking just beyond my sight. I knew, deep in the marrow of my bones, that something was wrong. But what unsettled me more was the creeping realization that perhaps it wasn't just in the building. Perhaps the horror had already slipped its way into my mind, threading its cold fingers through my thoughts, poisoning them with dread. I rose from my chair, though my limbs felt weighted, sluggish, as if something unseen resisted my movement. The room was dim, the glow of the monitors casting long, distorted shadows along the walls, shadows that seemed to twist and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. My breath hitched in my throat. It was a moment, no longer than a heartbeat, but it was enough. Enough for doubt to take root, enough for terror to bloom. The corridors beyond the control room were silent, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty building. No, this silence was heavy, unnatural, as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something or someone. I moved to the doorway, my footsteps muffled, yet somehow they felt too loud in the stillness. Every step I took reverberated with a dull thud, and with each thud my heart seemed to pound harder in my chest. I felt as though I was walking towards something inevitable, something that had been waiting for me all along. I stood at the threshold of the hallway, peering into the darkness that stretched ahead like the maw of some unspeakable beast. The dim lights that lined the corridor flickered weakly, casting their pale, sickly glow in uneven pulses, as though they too were struggling against the encroaching darkness. And in that pulsing light, I saw it again. The figure. It stood further down the hallway now, shrouded in the gloom, but unmistakable. Its outline was unnervingly still, as though it were carved from the very shadows that surrounded it. My throat tightened, a strangled cry of horror caught somewhere between my chest and lips, too afraid to be voiced. I wanted to turn, to flee back to the safety of the control room, but there was no safety there, not anymore. I forced myself to blink, to clear my vision, hoping, praying, that when I opened my eyes, it would be gone. But when I did, it was closer. I gasped, my breath ragged and shallow. My legs trembled beneath me, my body urging me to run, to escape. But my mind was locked in a paralyzing trance. How could it have moved without me seeing? The lights had not dimmed, the air had not stirred. And yet, the figure had drawn nearer, its formless silhouette more defined now, more real. The darkness around it seemed to bend and coil, like smoke clinging to the shape of a man, or something that once resembled a man. And though I could not see its face, I felt its eyes on me, cold and unblinking, watching me with a hunger that sent a violent shudder through my spine. A terrible thought clawed at my mind then, a thought I could not shake, no matter how much I wished to. The figure wasn't just watching, it was waiting, waiting for me to make a move, waiting for me to break the silence. In that moment, I realized something chilling. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't confined to the hallways or to the monitors. It was already here, in the building, in the room with me. No, it was deeper than that. It was inside me. It had wormed its way into the darkest corners of my mind, feeding off my fear, twisting my perception, turning the familiar into something grotesque and alien. And as I stood there, locked in the gaze of the shadow, I knew I was not alone. Not anymore. The horror had taken root, and it wasn't leaving. It is a peculiar thing, the way fear distorts time. The minutes stretched before me like a taut string, fragile and trembling, threatening to snap beneath the weight of my growing terror. The figure in the hall had vanished again, leaving only the oppressive silence in its wake, but its absence was far more unsettling than its presence had been. For in that absence, there was an insidious promise, a foreboding sense that this was but the beginning of a horror far beyond my comprehension. I retreated back into the control room, the walls seeming to close in around me, as if the building itself sought to ensnare me within its labyrinth of shadows. My pulse raced, each beat of my heart echoing in my ears, deafening in the stillness. I tried to steady my breath, but the air felt thick, heavy, as though tainted by some unseen malevolence. The monitors blinked in their cold, indifferent light, offering no comfort, only the stark reminder of the void that stretched just beyond the reach of their flickering gaze. I sat, my body trembling with a dread I could not name, my hands gripping the edge of the desk as if it might anchor me to some semblance of reality. But reality had begun to unravel. I could feel it slipping through my fingers like smoke, intangible, elusive. My thoughts were a maelstrom, each one darker than the last, spiraling into a depth I feared to explore. Had the figure been real? Or was it merely the projection of a mind slowly eroding beneath the strain of the night? I dared not voice these doubts aloud, for even in the solitude of the room, I felt watched, judged, by something lurking just beyond the veil of perception. It was a presence that gnawed at the edges of my sanity, a weight upon my soul that I could neither shake nor understand. I felt it in the stillness, in the way the shadows seemed to shift and writhe in the corners of my vision, always just out of sight, yet ever present. I turned my gaze to the monitors once more, though every fiber of my being screamed against it. There, in the cold glow of the screens, was the endless stretch of the hallways, silent, empty, devoid of life. But I knew better now. The emptiness was a lie. There was something hidden in that emptiness, something malevolent, waiting for me to let my guard down. The building had become a trap, a prison, and I was the prey. I stood, my legs unsteady beneath me, my breath shallow and ragged. The urge to flee, to abandon this place of creeping horrors, grew within me, a primal instinct that clawed at my resolve. But where could I go? The building was vast, and the night endless. The darkness would swallow me whole before I could reach the safety of the outside world. Assuming there was safety to be found at all. No, the darkness was not confined to the halls. It had followed me, seeping into my thoughts, coiling around my mind like a serpent, tightening with every passing second. I felt its presence in the silence, in the cold sweat that clung to my skin, in the way my heart pounded against my ribs as if trying to escape its cage. And then there came a sound, soft, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. A slow, deliberate creak, the groan of a door opening, somewhere deep within the bowels of the building. My blood turned to ice. The noise echoed through the empty corridors, a harbinger of the horror that awaited me. I knew, without a doubt, that it was coming for me. The door to the control room stood ajar, a thin sliver of darkness bleeding into the room. I stared at it, transfixed, my mind racing with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was it the wind, a draft stirring the old hinges? Or was it something else? Something far more sinister, beckoning me to step into its embrace, to confront the terror that had been stalking me in the shadows. I could hear my own breath, shallow and uneven, the pulse of my blood loud in my ears. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in closer, suffocating. I had to move. I had to do something. But my legs felt as though they were rooted to the floor, my body a puppet controlled by some invisible force, paralyzed by fear. And then, from the depths of the hallway beyond, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. The sound echoed off the walls, a hollow, rhythmic thud that reverberated through my very soul. Each step was a death knell, a reminder that whatever was out there, whatever had been watching me, was drawing nearer. I swallowed the scream that clawed at my throat, my heart hammering against my chest with a violence that threatened to tear me apart. The footsteps continued, closer now, steady and unhurried, as if the thing knew there was no need to rush. It had me. I was trapped, ensnared in its web, and there was nowhere left to run. The door creaked open a fraction more, the darkness beyond deepening, thick and impenetrable. And in that darkness, I saw them. Eyes. Cold, dead, staring back at me with an intensity that pierced through the veil of shadow. Eyes that held no life, no humanity, only an endless void of despair. And in that moment I knew. It had found me, and there was no escape. The room felt like a tomb now. The silence so profound it seemed to press against my ears, muting even the sound of my own breathing. Yet within that silence, a whispering began, not from the walls nor the hallways outside, but from within my own mind. It was a murmur that crawled through my thoughts, twisting itself into dark shapes, coiling like smoke, suffocating. I clutched my temples as if to hold my skull together, as though the very act of thinking might cause it to split apart, spilling all the madness that had crept in. I could no longer discern where the shadows ended and I began. They were everywhere, moving with a fluid grace that defied reason, shifting like the currents of a blackened sea, drawing closer, ever closer. And yet, it was the eyes that haunted me still. Those empty, lifeless orbs staring from the threshold of the door as if they had come to claim me. They bore into my soul, stripping away the thin veneer of sanity I clung to so desperately. I tried to move to flee, but my body was leaden, my limbs bound by an unseen weight. Fear rooted me to the floor, an icy hand wrapped around my throat, squeezing until every breath was a shallow, rasping gasp. My mind raced, spiraling into depths I had never known existed. I questioned everything. Had I imagined it? Had I conjured these phantoms from the recesses of my own fractured mind? Or had they always been here, lurking, waiting for the moment when I was weak enough to see them? But I knew, deep within the marrow of my bones, that this was no hallucination. It was real. Horrifyingly real. The presence in the hall was not some figment of my crumbling psyche. It was flesh and bone, or worse, something far beyond flesh, beyond anything human. And it was hungry. Hungry for fear, for madness, for the slow, deliberate unraveling of my mind. The footsteps had ceased. The oppressive silence had returned, but it was thick with an anticipation that set every nerve in my body aflame. Something waited in that stillness, something far worse than I could ever have imagined. I wanted to call out, to break the silence with a scream, but the words choked in my throat, my voice stolen by the terror that had gripped me. I could feel it now. It, the presence, moving just beyond the threshold of my sight. It lingered in the corners, where the light from the monitors faltered, where the shadows seemed to pool like liquid darkness. It whispered to me, though its voice was not of sound, but of thought. It burrowed into my mind, threading its way through every crevice, filling the cracks with cold dread. "You are not alone," it seemed to say, though the words were not spoken aloud. They slithered through my consciousness, curling around my deepest fears like a serpent, squeezing until I could scarcely breathe. I knew then that I could not stay here. This room, this sanctuary I had retreated to, had become a cage, a trap set by the thing that now hunted me. The walls, once solid, now seemed to pulse as though they too were alive, part of the same malevolent force that had claimed this building. The air was thick, oppressive, pressing down on me, suffocating with each passing second. I had to leave. I had to get out. But where could I go? The thought of stepping into the hallway, into the very darkness where the thing waited, was unbearable. Yet to stay was to invite something far worse. My thoughts were fractured, splintering beneath the weight of my fear. My reason eroded by the creeping madness that gnawed at the edges of my mind. Every sound, every flicker of movement in the periphery of my vision was magnified 100-fold, each one a harbinger of the terror I knew was coming for me. I could feel its gaze, cold and unfeeling, watching, waiting for the moment when I would break. I rose from the chair, my legs trembling beneath me as if they could barely support my weight. The monitors flickered, casting strange, twisted shadows on the walls, but I did not look at them. I could not. I knew what I would see, nothing but the endless, empty corridors, devoid of life. Yet it was in that emptiness that the thing thrived. It lived in the void, in the spaces between reality and nightmare, and it was drawing closer. With each step I took toward the door, the sense of doom intensified, wrapping itself around me like a shroud. The air grew colder, the silence more oppressive, until it felt as though I were walking through a nightmare made flesh. I reached for the door, my hand trembling, every instinct screaming for me to turn back, to lock myself away, to hide. But it was too late for that now. The darkness had already found me, and no lock or barrier could keep it at bay. As my fingers brushed the cold metal of the doorknob, I felt a presence behind me, a cold breath on the nape of my neck, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, terror flooding my veins. I could feel it there, just inches away, watching me with those dead, hollow eyes. And then in the silence, it spoke. The air thickened as I stood motionless, my hand hovering just over the doorknob, fingers outstretched but unable to grip it. I could not turn around. I dared not. For I knew with an unsettling certainty that if I looked, I would see the thing that had been haunting my every thought, my every waking nightmare. It was behind me, closer than ever before, its presence like a smothering veil, draping itself over my skin, suffocating me with its silent malice. There was a breath, not my own, a slow, deliberate exhalation, so cold, so intimate, that it felt as if it had passed directly through me. My skin prickled, the fine hairs on the back of my neck standing at full attention. The darkness had become more than a mere absence of light. It had transformed into something alive, something breathing. The shadows now carried weight, a density that pressed in on me, wrapping my thoughts in a suffocating fog. I closed my eyes, willing myself to breathe, to think, to move. But my limbs, once so obedient to my will, were now rebellious, frozen in place as though bound by unseen chains. The fear that had been gnawing at the edges of my mind had now fully consumed me, sinking its talons deep into my soul, paralyzing me with dread. I could hear it then, the faintest of sounds. A whisper, so soft it might have been imagined, yet it carried the weight of centuries of sorrow, of madness. It was not words, not exactly, but the feeling of words, as though they had formed in the air without being spoken, brushing against my mind like a fleeting breeze. It was beckoning me, calling me by name. How it knew my name, I could not fathom, but it echoed within me, reverberating in the deepest recesses of my consciousness. Come, it said, though not in the voice of a person, but in the voice of the void itself. The voice of the shadows that had been stalking me for nights on end. It was an invitation, but not one of warmth or welcome. No, it was the call of oblivion, the cold promise of surrender to something far darker than death. I could feel the pull, the seductive lure of the unknown, drawing me in, whispering of an end to all my fears, an end to everything. I wanted to scream, to break free of the invisible chains that held me, to flee from the suffocating presence that loomed just behind me. But no sound escaped my lips. My breath came in ragged gasps, the air thick and cold in my lungs, each exhale laced with a growing panic that threatened to consume me. My thoughts were a whirlpool of terror, swirling faster and faster as I felt my grip on reality slipping, my mind unraveling thread by thread. And still, it watched. The thing behind me. I could feel its gaze, those empty, hollow eyes, boring into the back of my skull, peeling away the layers of my mind like an onion, exposing every fear, every insecurity, every dark secret I had ever buried. It knew me, inside and out, in a way that no living creature ever could. And it reveled in my torment. The darkness, once confined to the edges of the room, had now fully engulfed me, swallowing the faint glow of the monitors, drowning out the dull hum of the security systems. I could no longer see the room, no longer feel the walls that had once enclosed me. There was only the void, stretching infinitely in every direction, and within that void the thing, silent, patient, waiting. But for what? What did it want from me? My mind scrambled for answers, for any explanation, any logical thread to cling to. But there was none. Logic had no place here, in this realm of shadows and whispers, only fear, and I was drowning in it. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move, to act. Slowly, agonizingly, I turned the knob. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed unnaturally in the oppressive silence, a high-pitched wail that set my teeth on edge. Beyond the door, the hallway stretched out into darkness, far darker than it had ever been before. It was as if the shadows had grown in strength, thickened, become sentient. With trembling steps, I moved forward, my heart thundering in my chest, each beat a painful reminder of the fragility of my existence. The air outside the control room was colder, more hostile, carrying with it the scent of decay, as if the building itself were rotting from within. I had taken no more than 2 steps when I heard it, the sound that shattered what little remained of my composure. Footsteps. not my own. They were faint at first, barely a whisper on the tile floors. But then they grew louder, heavier, each step deliberate, purposeful, echoing through the corridors with a cadence that mirrored my own heartbeat. They were coming from behind me, growing closer with each passing second. I spun around, my pulse hammering in my ears, expecting, dreading what I might see. But there was nothing. Only the empty hallway stretching out before me, bathed in the dim, flickering light of the emergency bulbs. And yet, the footsteps persisted, growing louder, as though the very walls themselves were walking, pursuing me, stalking me through this labyrinth of fear. I was not alone. I had never been alone. It was there, just beyond the veil of darkness, waiting for me to falter, waiting for me to run. And I knew, in the deepest recesses of my soul, that no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I fled, it would always be there. It always had been. I had fled the control room, my steps hurried, irrational, driven by a primal need to escape, though escape from what, I still could not name. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, a tunnel of shadows, each flickering light above casting more doubt than illumination. The walls felt as if they were closing in, narrowing with every step, suffocating in their proximity. I had become a prisoner within this empty, decaying building, no longer a guardian of its secrets, but a captive to something far older, far darker than mere architecture. And yet, as I stumbled through the corridor, I could not shake the feeling that I had wandered into a space that did not belong to this world. The very air was wrong. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in a slow, grotesque rhythm, as though the building itself had become a living entity, pulsating with malignant life. The shadows that clung to the corners of my vision twisted unnaturally, writhing as though alive, and though I told myself they were tricks of the mind, born of exhaustion and fear, I could not believe it. There was purpose in their movement, a vile, creeping intent that sent a shiver of dread racing down my spine. I stopped suddenly, frozen in place by a sensation so chilling, so invasive, that it felt as though ice had seeped into my veins. There it was again, the breath. Not my own. This time, it was unmistakable, slow, deep. It passed over the back of my neck, a caress of cold air that carried with it the stench of something foul, something rotting. My skin prickled violently, and I instinctively clutched my arms around myself, but no amount of physical defense could shield me from the knowledge that something stood directly behind me, something close enough to touch. I dared not turn around. To do so felt akin to inviting death itself. But what was I waiting for? What did I hope to achieve by standing there, paralyzed with my back to the void? If I remained, it would claim me. I knew this. It would reach out, its unseen hand wrapping around my throat, dragging me into whatever hell it had crawled from. And yet I could not move. My body had betrayed me, locked in place by terror so profound, so absolute, that it had rendered me a mere husk of myself. The breath came again, more insistent this time, heavier. I could hear it now, could feel the weight of it in the air, pressing down on me like a physical force. It was not just a breath. It was something larger, something monstrous, inhaling the very essence of the space around me. Each exhalation carried with it a sense of dread so powerful that it felt as though the walls themselves would buckle under its weight. I squeezed my eyes shut, clenching my fists so tightly that my nails dug into the flesh of my palms. Pain, real pain, surged through me, a small mercy, a tether to reality. I needed to focus, needed to ground myself in something tangible, something that was not this overwhelming void of terror that threatened to swallow me whole. And then, in the midst of that suffocating silence, I heard it. A voice. But it was not human. It was a low, guttural sound, a rasping, wheezing thing that seemed to come not from any throat, but from the very air itself. It whispered my name, not in the way that a friend might call, nor even the way an enemy might taunt. No, this was different. It was the voice of something that knew me, intimately. something that had always known me, that had been waiting in the dark corners of my mind for this moment, for this night. "Come to me," it breathed, the words sliding like oil through the silence, clinging to my thoughts, seeping into the cracks of my mind. The voice was everywhere, yet nowhere. It resonated in my skull, echoing endlessly, as though it had come from within me, as though it had always been there. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the room spinning around me. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave, crashing over any semblance of rational thought. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, barely able to hold me upright. My eyes fluttered open, and for the briefest of moments, I glimpsed something in the reflection of the glass beside me. A figure, tall, emaciated, its skin stretched taut over a skeletal frame, its eyes, oh God, those eyes, black, hollow and staring. Not at me, no, through me, as if it could see the very essence of my soul, as if it could reach out and take it. I screamed, not out loud, but inside, the kind of scream that never escapes your throat, the one that dies in the depths of your terror, strangled by fear. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. But I knew it hadn't left. It was with me now, inside me, its whispers crawling through the labyrinth of my mind. And I could feel it, patiently waiting for the moment when I would surrender, when I would let it in. It is said that in the face of overwhelming horror, the mind seeks solace in madness, a fragile refuge where reason crumbles, and in its place, only the abyss of oblivion remains. I had thought this sentiment to be a mere fancy, the words of poets and madmen, until that night. The night I finally understood the truth of it. I stood alone in the control room once more, my sanctuary of screens and buzzing monitors. But they were useless to me now, mere windows into a world that no longer made sense. I could no longer trust the flickering images they offered, for they had shown me too much. Things that could not be, and yet were. The figure, the breath, the shadows. They had bled into my reality, and now there was no distinction between what was real and what was conjured by the malevolent force that clung to me like a second skin. The air in the room was thick with decay, the stench of something far older than death itself. It hung in the corners, curling like smoke, unseen yet undeniably present. My hands trembled uncontrollably, my fingers twitching as though they belonged to someone else. I no longer felt like myself. I was no longer myself. I had become something else entirely, something hollow, consumed by terror, lost in the labyrinth of my own fear. I could hear it, you see, the voice, the one that had whispered to me, that had beckoned me into the depths of my own nightmare. It was no longer content to linger at the edges of my consciousness. Now it filled the room, its every word a dark, honeyed promise that slithered into my ears and coiled around my thoughts. "Come to me," it murmured, the words dripping with malice, sweet and sickening all at once. Each syllable echoed in the stillness, rippling through the air like the softest breath of wind, yet laden with the weight of something far more sinister. The voice was no longer a distant specter. It was here, with me, around me, inside me. I fought it, of course. I tried. My mind screamed against it, clawed desperately at the edges of reason, begging for some small shred of sanity to cling to. But the truth, the awful, unbearable truth, was that I no longer wanted to fight. The more it whispered, the more it called, the more I felt myself drawn to it, like a moth to flame, helpless against the pull of its dark gravity. My gaze drifted toward the far corner of the room, where the shadows had gathered in a pool of inky blackness. It was there, in that corner, that I saw it again. The figure. No longer a mere reflection, no longer a fleeting apparition. It stood fully before me now, tall and skeletal, its form twisted and grotesque. The hollow blackness of its eyes stared through me, and in them I saw something that chilled me to the very marrow of my bones. I saw myself. I staggered back, choking on a scream that lodged itself in my throat. The figure moved with me, its movements grotesque, a distorted mirror of my own terror. its limbs elongated unnaturally, its fingers impossibly long, curled into claws that scraped against the floor as it moved closer. There was a hunger in its empty gaze, a need that I felt resonate within my own chest. "You cannot hide," it rasped, its voice no longer a whisper, but a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the very foundations of the room. The words crawled over my skin, seeping into my flesh, and I felt them burrow deep in the core of my being. And then it spoke again, but this time the voice did not come from the figure. It came from my own lips. "I am you." The words fell from my mouth before I even realized they were mine, and in that moment, the last fragile thread of my sanity snapped. The figure was not an intruder in my life. It was me. It had always been me, lurking in the darkest recesses of my mind, feeding on my fears, growing stronger with every night I had spent alone in that cursed building. I had invited it in, unknowingly, and now it had become part of me. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest, and I stumbled back, collapsing into the chair behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so violently I feared it might tear itself free from my chest. I stared at the figure, no, at myself, and I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The shadows writhed around us, twisting and contorting, closing in as though they were alive. I could feel the room itself constricting, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in, trapping me in this nightmare with no escape. But there was no need to escape. Not anymore. I had already surrendered. The moment I had allowed the voice to seep into my mind, the moment I had let the fear consume me, I had become part of it. I was the shadow. I was the figure in the dark. With trembling hands, I reached out, touching the icy coldness of the figure's skeletal frame. The moment my fingers made contact, a flood of memories surged through me, memories that were not my own. I saw the faces of those who had come before me, those who had stood in this very room, who had seen the same shadows, heard the same whispers. They had all succumbed, just as I had. And now, I would join them. The last thing I remember before the darkness claimed me was the cold, lifeless hand of the figure gripping mine, pulling me into the shadows. And then, silence. Thank you for watching. This video, like all the others on the channel, is made especially for you who love chilling content. I put a lot of care into creating each one. Please support the channel by subscribing so you won't miss any notifications and can help it grow. Be sure to watch the video on your screen now so we can stay connected. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. See you in the next one.